Hi everyone, and welcome back to the YellowDog 3D Tips blog. Today we're going to be going over how to stitch a HDRI together properly, and we'll be creating something that looks a lot like this. As you can see, there's plenty of detail in the lightest points of the image, like the sky, and we've got still loads of detail in the dark areas as well, such as the door here. There are a few problems with this image, such as the missing area at the bottom and the yellow lines look a little bit messed up, but that's not a problem. We'll go over how to fix that during the tutorial. So here you can see all of my source images. I was lucky enough to get my hands on an 8mm lens with a full frame sensor, which gives you pretty much 180 degrees, which I think is perfect for creating HDRIs. I set up the camera on a tripod and shot every 90 degrees, so 4 images for a 360. And these are all bracketed as well, so there is 7 stops of exposure for each of the images, which gives us 28 photos in total. So I'm not going to go over too much on how to shoot these. There's lots of resources online. We're going to focus today on just how to stitch them properly and create a true HDRI. So the software we're going to be using to do this is called PTGui, or PTGui as some people like to call it. So I'm just going to load up a new blank document and click load images, and this is where we select all of our bracketed images, so all 28 of them. We just click load. You may have a different amount depending on how you shot your HDRI. Also, up in this top corner you will see a little advanced switch. I like to click this because it gives you more stitching options to work with. So we're ready to click align images, and if you bracketed them properly, it will show you this options window, which is basically telling you that the program's recognise that you've bracketed your images and is asking how you want them to be stitched. So we're going to click enable HDR mode on the bracketed images, and HDR method is set to exposure fusion. So now if we just hit OK, it will stitch our images for us and put everything in the right place. So let's have a look. Things usually look a little bit weird in this kind of preview window, but don't be put off because this isn't what it actually looks like. All these seams that you can see are going to be taken care of when we save the image. Our projection mode is always equi-rectangular, which gives us a 360 degree spherical image, which will work perfectly for a HDRI. However, it does give you a good representation of how well the image has been stitched, and I can see a few problems, especially with the yellow line on the road, so we're going to take care of those now. So if we go over to control points, this tool allows you to set reference points between your images, and this allows you to create reference points on the images, which tells the software where certain features are from one image to the other. Because I've done 7 brackets of exposure, I'm going to have to select 0 on the first one and 7 on the next, which is 1 90 degree turn. So on the left image, I'm just going to select a feature on the ground in one of these problem areas where it couldn't stitch accurately. And on the next image, I'm going to find that same point and just set a reference point by left clicking again. The coloured numbers that you already see in this window are just reference points that the software has automatically detected for us, so it does a pretty good job of that, but sometimes you do need to add a few manual points in just to help the stitching in places. So hopefully that point will have fixed the little break on the road. If I skip forward to image number 7 on the left window and 14 on the right window, this will show me the next 90 degrees that we need to fix. I think we're getting quite a lot of problems with this yellow line on the floor, so I'm just going to add some more reference points to just help the software stitch it better. The more points you add, the better chance you have of getting a good solid stitch with no visible seams. So I'm just going to add a few more in on this particular area, and we're just looking for any features that we can see on both images. Obviously you want to be placing these as accurately as possible across the images, and I think there was a bit of a problem on the other side of the road on the image, so I'm just going to go to picture 0 on the left and picture 21 on the right, and I'm just going to carry on adding control points. So all we're doing is finding features that are the same and correspond over 2 of the images. You do this in the areas which are problematic, which the software couldn't stitch and was giving you a nasty seam. So I'm just going to put one near this yellow line, and I just want to make sure that this yellow line gets stitched correctly, because when you have lines that do run all the way through your HDRI, it's going to be really obvious if there is a problem there. So I think we've covered all the problem areas, so I'm just going to go to crop and make sure that the crop is set correctly. This is just cutting off the very edges, but you can adjust it with the values at the side. It's actually quite beneficial to cut off the very edges of a fisheye photo, just because at these edges things tend to get really warped, and it can just sometimes mess up the way it stitches and give you warped edges. So with that all done, we click align images again with the same settings, and this is just going to run through. This will take some time depending on how fast your computer is, but as you can see now, these edges seem to be working pretty well. Like I said, that is just a rough preview, and a lot of the problems that you see with this image won't appear on the actual exported HDRI, but I do think we can make the seam a little bit better. So if we go over to the mask tab, and this basically gives you manual control over the seams. So if you are getting a lot of distortion in a certain area, you can mask it out and just use more of the other image for this area. So if you just left click and drag, you can just paint in an area which you just want to get rid of, substitute that part in from another image, and that mask will translate over all your brackets, so you only need to do it once. So I'm just going to go back over to the project assistant tab and align the images again, and hopefully this time we'll see an improved version. And I feel like we've taken care of this seam now, and it's going to work a lot better than the previous tries. So now if we go to the preview tab and hit preview, and preview in PTGui viewer, it will create a preview of the final HDRI where we can have a look at the seams. As you can see, there is still a problem on the opposite side, but on this side I feel like the stitch is working quite well. There is a slight discrepancy, but I can live with that. So what we need to do now is just add a little bit of a mask on this area, just so that we can get it to stitch a little bit nicer. So if I go over to picture 0, I'm just going to try and mask this little area where we've got the problem, and this will substitute in the other image for this part of the overlap. And to further help the stitch, I'm going to add in a few more control points. So I think it's picture 6 and picture 27 is where we have this overlap. So I'm just going to add in a few little details for the control points. So this little marking on the road, try and locate that in the next image. So I think we've done pretty well there. I'm just going to add in a few more of these to really help that seam, and just keep going in this fashion until you're pretty confident that you've selected enough points for the software to be able to calculate the seam correctly. I'm just going to add one more point in just for safe measure. So just another one of these little markings on the road, not quite sure what they are, but there we go, that's the same point over both images. So go and align your images again, and here's the preview of what we just did. Obviously this isn't accurate, so we're just going to want to preview it properly again. Just hit preview, default resolution will be fine for what we're doing now, and hopefully we will fix the seam. Yep, as you can see, the seam there works perfectly. There's no massive issues. It's not totally perfect, but if we wanted to spend more time on it, we probably could get it looking a little bit more perfect, but for this tutorial I think this will work perfectly now. So if we just close this window, we can add a few more corrections to it. So if we go over to the exposure/HDR tab and click optimize now, it's just going to get rid of some of the vignetting that comes naturally with the lens, and it'll just make the overall HDRI just look a little bit nicer. So now we want to export our image, so if we go over to the create panorama tab, and in the LDR format select TIFF with no compression, and select a folder for the files to export to. So I'm just going to call this one stitched HDRI, and then just double click on this and click save, and this is where our images are going to go to. So the main elements that we're going to need are the blend planes. By ticking this box, we're telling the software to export 7 stitched panoramics, just all at different exposures. So once this completes, we can look in our folder, and the first image we see is just the whole panorama together. We won't really be using this, it's just nice to have for reference, but the thing that we really need are these bracketed exposure panoramics. So you can see there's a really dark one ranging all the way up to a really light one. There should be 7 of these because that's how many brackets we took for each angle, and from this point we can now take these exposures into Photoshop and we'll create our final HDR file, which we will be using to light things in our 3D program. So once you've got Photoshop open, go to File, Automate and Merge to HDR Pro, and just navigate to these files. Make sure you don't select the first one, we just want the exposure range. In our case there is 7 images because we did 7 brackets of exposure, and just click OK. This usually takes a while, but once it finishes doing what it's doing, you'll see a window that looks like this where it has merged everything. So you want to select 32-bit for a proper HDRI, and you can sort of grade the image here, but I don't think this is that useful. If we click the little box below it, complete toning in Adobe Camera Raw, this is going to let us just sort of do some color correction in the Camera Raw window that we sort of used to seeing when we're editing still photos. This usually takes quite a while, but once it's finished loading you'll get a window that looks like this, and in my opinion this just looks a little bit sort of desaturated, a little bit grey, so I'm just going to crank the vibrance and saturation. Really, if you want it to be super accurate, you should have a reference image to what you're correcting to. For example, if you were creating a VFX shot, this would be your footage, but here we have the merged HDR image in Photoshop. It is running in 32-bit mode, so a lot of your tools are going to be limited, but now we're going to fix just the bottom part of the image where we have some pixel stretching. These are just areas that the lens couldn't stretch to, so we're just going to do a simple clone stamp on this and bring the detail back, but we need to rasterize the layer first to be able to perform any kind of edits. So I know a lot of you will be familiar with this kind of clone stamping. All you do is press Alt on your keyboard and select a reference area, and then when you start painting, it will just take the pixels from that area and put them wherever your brush is. So this doesn't have to be too accurate unless you're creating a scene in 3D that's going to be reflecting these areas really cleanly, but usually we don't really have that sort of setup or scenario, so I'm just going to do this quite rough. Obviously the more time you want to spend on this kind of job, the better it's going to be, but I'm just going to do this quite fast and rough just for demonstration purposes. So just going to fill in these ones really quickly, just copy the area from directly above. It'd be quite difficult to notice that there's anything happening there because it's all just this similar road texture. And there we have it, the final thing. We need to save it out now, but I'm just going to double check that we are in 32-bit mode because that's what we need for the HDRI. So yeah, I'm just going to click Save As, and I'm just going to find a suitable folder to put the final product in, call it HDRI, and we need to select a HDR radiance format, which is what all 3D programs use for a HDRI, and I'm just going to let this save out and run through. Because it's such a large file, it usually takes a little moment to finish saving out, and this is the HDRI we're going to be using for reflections, but there are a lot of people that say that this kind of map doesn't work too greatly for creating your lighting, and I know a lot of people do create a blurred version as well. Apparently this just helps the 3D program evenly light things. I'm not really sure how that works, but if you want to do this, I've seen this is a way a lot of people do it, is just add a Gaussian blur to the whole HDRI and just find a value that looks okay. I'm not quite sure whether this is an exact science, but usually I just find something that looks okay. I just sort of aim to see still a lot of the detail but none of the sharp, fine detail. So I'm just going to try a radius of 25 on the Gaussian blur, and that looks okay to me. And I'll just save this out as a separate file. I'm going to use the same radiance format, and I'll just call this one HDRI blurred. Like I say, I'll be using this blurred one for the overall lighting, and I'll be using the sharp one as the reflection map. Just jumping over to Cinema 4D, we've got our trusty YellowDog logo, and I've just done a really rough basic setup using these maps, and with global illumination on, I'll just hit render, and as you can see, the object's reflecting the correct things. I've done a slight reflective material on the dog and the text, and this object's also being lit by our HDRI image. So this is just a really basic setup. You could go more advanced and put shadows in, configure things a little bit better, but this is just a really rough and quick example. There is a lot to creating a HDRI correctly. There is way more advanced stuff that you could be doing than this, but hopefully this has provided you with a little bit of insight into creating a good HDRI that will work, and hopefully this will be a good starting point for you and will allow you to start using HDRI lighting in your future projects. This has been the YellowDog 3D Tips blog. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more 3D tips. Cheers.